All right, how's it going, y'all? So today we're going to talk about the fact that there is a massive group of hacked devices that have created a botnet that are trying to break into Synologies all around the world. We're going to talk about what it is, how to protect yourself against it, and also why it's not necessarily as scary as that sounds, because it is actually something that is not as big of a deal as you might think. In a lot of ways, this is not what to worry about compared to other much more risky situations. But we're going to talk about all today, and why if you've logged into your NAS and you've got port 5000 or 5001 open to the internet, you may have seen your screen look just like this, with thousands of login attempts with either the username admin or with a dictionary attack of random names. And so we're going to go through, talk about what's happened and how to protect yourself against this. All right, so first off, what is a botnet and what is going on? So a botnet is essentially a bunch of devices that have been hacked, and they're actually probably devices that are not owned by the hackers at all. Instead, hackers have found a bunch of IoT devices and routers that had bad security. Either default passwords, stuff open the internet, who knows what, but especially things that use Telnet, very old insecure protocol, and have essentially been able to brute force or hack their way into them in some way and start controlling them. And they then use these devices to actually hack and take more devices. And so in this case, there are tens of thousands of IP addresses, which means tens of thousands of unique devices who are essentially compromised, and these hackers can tell these devices to do whatever they want. And their goal is to make money, obviously. Now, hacking into somebody's router or smart fridge probably is not going to be of very much value to you, because people who have these insecure devices, you don't even know how to get their information enough to get them to pay you. There's no value in there. So what these hacker groups do is essentially they take all of them and they use them to try to brute force their way into devices. And that is what creates a botnet. Essentially, you have thousands of devices, specifically with thousands of different public IP addresses, all taking a turn trying to guess their way into a device. And in this case, they are scanning the internet for either port 5000 or 5001 open to the internet. And if they find it, they are going to essentially start trying to log into DSM and hopefully get your admin credentials. And if they do, they'll actually manually log in, encrypt your files, and then go ahead and send you a message that says, hey, you have to pay us X, Y, and Z Bitcoin in order to get your files back. But first, I'd like to take a quick break to thank the sponsor of today's video, DeleteMe. Did you know that your personal data is sold online by data brokers? You have the right to stay private and protect your personal data. Data brokers are corporations that collect a huge amount of personal information, like phone numbers, addresses, and even your relatives, from a variety of sources, like government public records and social media. They then aggregate this information into listings or profiles and then sell it to either other data brokers or other organizations who have an interest in your private data. Having this information out there increases the risk of being a target of identity theft, which has been made easier by the prevalence of personal information online. And that's where DeleteMe comes in. DeleteMe can help protect you from the risks of identity theft by removing your personal data from hundreds of data brokers online. They will then provide a privacy report showing what data they were able to find and remove, and will continue to monitor and repeat removals as required. I personally have used DeleteMe and recommend it to help protect your personal information. Get 20% off DeleteMe US customer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Rex and use promo code REX at checkout. That is code REX at joindeleteme.com/Rex. Thanks again to DeleteMe for sponsoring today's video. Now back to the video. So that is the goal of this situation. Essentially to get admin login to the NAS so that they can upload malicious code, which will essentially encrypt every single file on the NAS and then demand ransom protection. That's overall the setup. And the important thing that makes this work is the fact that they have thousands of IP addresses. Because one of the first things that everybody should do, and if you don't already, you should, is set up Autoblock. Autoblock is very simple. If an IP address guesses a login too many times incorrectly in X amount of time, it will actually just block that IP address from doing anything. And so if you've only got a few IP addresses, it'll take millions of years to have a 50% chance of guessing a password. But If you have 10,000 IP addresses, well, now you might actually have a chance to be able to get in because AutoBlock only blocks IP addresses. If you've got 50 different accounts or 5,000 different IP addresses, it is not going to block those. And so that is what these groups are trying to do. The groups try two different things. First, they try admin. So this is why it's the very first step you should always do if you're upgrading NAS or anything like that, is make sure your admin account is disabled. That is the account labeled admin. Because these attackers are guessing the username admin. And if you have a different username than that, it's almost like having a different password. It's almost like they have to guess two passwords rather than just one because they don't even know what your admin username is. They don't know what your account names are. And so they first have to guess the account name and then guess the password. And so you're almost doubling your layers of security. So they are first trying admin and seeing if they can get in. Then if they're unsuccessful, they will go in and start a dictionary attack. Essentially, they've got a dictionary composed of the top, I think like probably 10,000 usernames, and they're just going in one by one and guessing those to see if they get in. And so that's basically their MO. And while this seems really scary, when you see your log page and you see 5,000 logs saying, hey, somebody's trying to get into my NAS, that is a scary situation, right? But I'll be honest with you, this is not the thing to worry about. The thing to worry about is the person who actually has an exploit, who actually can get into DSM without credentials. Somebody who finds a vulnerability in Synology DSM that lets them get in without doing this brute force. While this attack looks scary, if the NAS they're going after has the most basic security stuff that I've gone in videos, they're not going to get really far at all for numerous reasons. But that's not the point for these guys. These guys don't have to break into every NAS. They don't even have to break into 1% of NASs. The way this works is it's so low effort for them to try 10,000 NASs that even if just 10 people they get a 0.1% return, it is still financially worth it for them. So they're really looking for the lowest common denominator to be able to get in. And so that's how this works. And that's why it's really important to kind of schedule yourself once a year. Go in, log in the NAS, and check your security stuff. Make sure you're up to date. Make sure all those things are there because while this is not a big deal if you keep up to date and you've got a good password, well, if you've kind of not looked into security stuff for 5 years and the NAS has just been plugging along, those new things may have changed and you may need different security stuff. And so now let's go ahead and talk about what you should do when you see this and also how to protect yourself from this in general and just give a good security overhaul. I actually manage a lot of client NASs who this is going on with. Some of them are even available with SFTP, so they're getting SSH attempts. And there's been a large increase over the past 6 months in these. And so it's pretty common, but it's still nothing necessarily to worry about. I actually have a dashboard where I just see the numbers keep going up, but we're going to talk about what security things to do to really mitigate the possibility of this occurring. And we're going to go from the least intrusive down to the most intrusive. As in, we're going to start with things that are not going to affect your daily life and kind of move up to things that may limit the capability of your NAS one way or the other at the benefit of security. So first off, let's go in and make sure we've got 3 things for every single NAS. First off, you should really make sure that your admin account is disabled. If you look, these botnets are spending 90% of the time trying the word admin as the username. So disable that, deactivated it. And so if you come in here and admin is enabled, make sure 1, that you're not signed in with the admin account. If you are, just create a new account as an administrator. And then 2, come in here, hit edit, and deactivate the account. I also am weird. I will often just change the password to something random and save it like that. I don't think it does anything. Deactivating it should be totally fine, but I always just do that more so than anything, just in case there was ever a weird thing that happened. I do change that password. And so just by having that account as disabled, you are going to really be able to weather the vast majority of these people because they're not looking for you. They're looking for that NAS running DSM 6.2 and still having the admin account enabled because they've never changed it. Those are the people it's looking for. So then after you've done that, the next thing you want to do is you want to come into security and make sure you've got protection auto block enabled. I did tell you that auto block isn't going to do anything for this specific attack, but it's still really important to have in there. So really easy recommendation is 10 attempts within 5 minutes and unblock after 4 days. That way, if you're on vacation, anything happens, you accidentally block yourself out, it'll expire after 4 days. And these settings are still very restrictive. So it's not like you're going to be able to be a sitting duck or anything like that, because this will limit that. So just make sure you've got auto block enabled. And the next thing you really want to do is you need to come in and enable under account protection, enable account protection. This is the trick. So just as I said earlier, these botnets have tens of thousands of IP addresses at their disposal. So auto block doesn't do anything, but account protection actually gives you the flip side. So whereas auto block checks the IP address to see if they have guessed a login X number of times within the last X minutes, account protection doesn't care about the IP address, it cares about the username. And so if account protection detects that a username is being logged into 5 times within 1 minute, it's going to block that username from being logged in for 30 minutes. So if somebody is using 50,000 IP addresses and trying to brute force your account, they're going to get the account locked for all IP addresses for 30 minutes. And this can be a huge slowdown, and why it's definitely worth enabling for you, because you don't want somebody to figure out your username and then all of a sudden they can use all these IP addresses to eventually get in with a matter of months. Instead, you want to go ahead and make sure that they are locked, and you will really slow down any kind of attack for that. That being said, if you ever do see multiple login attempts for your actual username in a row, you should be worried and really go in and figure out what's going on and shut the NAS off until you can figure that out, because that's actually a situation. But this will really limit the capability of somebody, even if they do get the username right, being able to start brute forcing their way in, even if they have tons of IP addresses. So that's a great thing to have. You will see, you'll get notices that the admin account has been locked due to account protection if you do have this. So I will often go in and then just go into notification and disable that if it is going on, just because you don't want to get a zillion of those emails and then you stop looking at the emails. So that is the way to do it. You can really limit the exposure of you by having that. So those are 3 settings that are incredibly easy to do and should not disrupt the NAS at all. Next up is going to be adaptive MFA. This is essentially zero overhead and is a super easy way of adding in a lot more protection, because adaptive MFA works just like your bank account does. If it detects that you're logging in from an IP address that you don't normally log in with, or it's external, it's going to say, hey, let's just double check this and send you an email to your email address, and you put in a code. I love this. This is a feature that came out with DSM 7.2 and is going to make this whole thing way harder to hack into, because now with adaptive MFA, even if these hackers guess your password and guess your username, they're probably also not hacked into your email. So it makes it so much harder. It's really simple and does not have a large disruption on your ability to use the NAS. And so it's definitely something that you should enable every single time, though unfortunately it is only on DSM 7.2 or later, so it may be worth updating just for that. All right, so those were all things that have really minimal disruption to your daily life and actually the use of the NAS. We're going to start talking about some additional things here that are a little bit harder. So while adaptive MFA is great, 2-factor is always going to be better, because 2-factor works on everything and it actually uses a pre-shared code to make sure it goes in. So if you do have the ability to run a mail server and you know how to use 2-factor authentication codes and you know how to keep them, and you know whenever you get a new phone, you need to make sure you update that, it's a good idea to enable 2-factor authentication for all administrator users. I've got videos on that. It's pretty easy to set up, and it is more secure than adaptive MFA alone. So that's the next step up. Though for people who aren't used to having an authenticator code, it can be very difficult to use and a bit of a pain. The next thing that's not too disruptive, but a little bit, is to actually change the port number. This is often called security through obscurity, and in this case, it does actually have a large impact because these botnets are really low effort. They are just going for the lowest common denominator. And so one really easy thing you can do is just not run DSM publicly on port 5000 and 5001. You can change it to anything. Choose 8981. This is only the case if you do have DSM open up to the internet. If you're only running DSM locally, as in you don't have port 5000 or 5001 open to the internet through your router, there's no benefit in doing this. But if you do want to be able to access it specifically publicly through either DDNS or faster Quickconnect, this will actually help because now nobody knows you're running a Synology NAS when they do the first pass. And this actually helps a ton. Even though this is not doing anything from a true security perspective, it's really just hiding behind a sea of chaos. So instead of just being a easy, hey, they're running Synology NAS because they've got 5001 open, it takes way longer to scan all 60,000 ports. And this is one of those things where if you just change the port number, these botnets that are really dumb and really simple aren't even going to notice you because they're only looking for 5000, 5001. This is not going to do too much for people who are really targeting you specifically because it's not that hard to do a full scan. But just from a, hey, I don't want to deal with all the chaos and clutter of the internet, change the default port can help a lot for that. And everybody who I do with that don't get these login attempts. If you do this, it's going to restart the web server, and then you're going to have to go in and redo your port forwarding rules. And if you're using DDNS, you're going to have to tell all of your clients, hey, this is updated. But if you use Quickconnect, it'll automatically figure it out. All right, so now let's go ahead and talk about things that are a little bit more disruptive, but can actually be very effective in these cases. And let's talk about geo-blocking because it's actually surprisingly effective. So I have my threat map right here. These are all my clients that I monitor, their bad login attempts from the last month, and there's 170,000 of them. It is a ton of logins going around the world. The vast majority of these are outside the United States. So what you can do is you can actually block everybody who is not in your country from accessing the DSM web page. And that is not a bad idea at all to do. So if you wanted to, you can really say, you know, I never travel. I never need to send files to people who are outside of my country. Well, let's go in and I'm going to show you how to make a firewall rule to block people who are not in your country from accessing the web page. And so they're never going to even be able to log in. And so what we can do is we can come into Control Panel and actually set up a firewall rule. I would always disable this firewall notification, and we're going to go ahead and just set it up where we're going to make it really easy. So what we're going to do is we are going to block DSM from outside of our home country. For me, I'm going to do US, and you can actually choose as many countries as you want here. And we're actually going to first allow DSM from our local IP addresses. We're actually going to allow all from this. I'm going to set this up very simply where everybody can fill this out. So it's going to be a little bit long-winded here. So we're going to first go in and allow all the local networks. If you've watched my video on setting up firewall rules, it's going to be identical to that start. All right, so I'm blowing through this because I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I want to give you something that you can easily add on into your own NAS. So what we've done right here is we have first gone in and we've specifically said all the local IP addresses written down in RFC 1918 are allowed into all ports. So if somebody's on the local network, we're not going to do any blocking. You can change this later on if you want to, but that is our basics here. So we're going to say, hey, all local stuff is not going to be blocked from the firewall at least. And then we're going to now go ahead and say, hey, now we're going to say DSM. DSM is going to be allowed from what country we'd like to. And Synology has a really easy location option here. And we're just going to say the US. And if you do business with other countries and other specific things, you can check off these as well. Anything else you like. I believe there's a limit of a certain number of countries here, but it's easy enough to add in. So now what we're saying is anybody who is in the United States, we're not going to block going to DSM. And then we're going to go ahead and say, hey, everybody else deny. So just like that, you can set up where, okay, only people in the United States are able to access the web interface of DSM. Or you could also say, all right, anybody else going to DSM is denied. So what you can do there is you can really customize this down to whatever you like. So you could use maybe Synology Drive Share Sync with anybody in the world, but block DSM. There's a lot of options there, but the most basic options are going to be this right here. Allow all on the local networks. Make sure these are always up here. Then for DSM, we're going to allow any countries we want specifically, and then everything else deny. And so this is a really easy firewall rule that should work for everybody. If you use something like Tailscale, you may need to add in those IP addresses here as well, but this is the basics there. So that is a simple firewall rule that will lock out everybody who's not in your country, which is limiting this by a factor of 100 in my case. And so it's really easy to go ahead and actually do all this stuff with. And that's a great place to start. All right, so now everything we've talked about so far shouldn't have been too big of a deal for most people. Now we're going to talk about actually limiting the capability of the NAS for the sake of security. And that's actually where using Quickconnect alone, instead of using DDNS or Synology.me, can actually be a lot more secure in this case. Because if we do not open up those DSM ports to Quickconnect, it's going to force it to use what's called a relay server. And this means that we don't have to have any worry about blocking on our end because Synology does not let those connections on through. So the next step is to just disable port forwarding entirely for 5000, 5001, or whatever your DSM ones are. And the biggest downside of this is sharing files and being able to quickly access files remotely. So if you use something like Synology Photos with your family and you want a really fast connection, well, unfortunately, Quickconnect is not that fast when it's used with a relay server, and so it will slow things down. But that is by far the most secure way of doing this, is to just limit down Quickconnect or even disable Quickconnect entirely and only use something like a VPN server. But those are much more disruptive. And so if you use the NAS to be able to share massive files with businesses who you don't want to give a VPN connection to, those kinds of things might not necessarily work. And that's why it's really important to have things like two-factor authentication enabled and things like that. Whew. Okay, so I know there were a ton of things there, but I wanted to give it in a nice list where you can start from stuff that everybody can do and it's not going to disrupt your NAS, all the way to things that are going to limit real functionality of the NAS, depending on what you're doing. The biggest thing to do is to stay up to date. Across the board here is making sure that your NAS is not really out of date will help a ton because there are CVEs being patched all the time, vulnerabilities in DSM that are patched and fixed before anybody can actually exploit them. So by keeping your NAS up to date, you will also really be helped there. All right, well, I hope you found that helpful. I do want people to remember, while this looks scary, in a lot of ways, if you followed security best practices in this case, you're really not too much at risk because these are bots who are looking for people who have not set up things properly and have an easy way in. Use strong passwords, use two-factor authentication, and don't use the regular admin account, and you're going to be very protected from this specific case, and it's just an easy way to mitigate your exposure in general. If you'd like to hire me, there's a link for that down in the description below, and have a good one. Bye.